So, everybody, a very warm welcome to the Department of Sociology and Criminology seminar series. And the focus today is revisiting development theories. We have four fantastic speakers, and we will delighted to welcome Professor Pádraig Carmody, who will be speaking first. And Pádraig is Professor in Geography at Trinity College, where he did his undergraduate and master's work, and is a Senior Research Associate also at the University of Johannesburg. And Professor Carmody is going to talk about his new book today on development theory and practice in a changing world. So it's really great to welcome you here, and we're really looking forward to your presentation and opening a conversation around development practice in a changing world. Our second speaker is Dr. Su-Ming Khoo, who is a senior lecturer in Political Science and Sociology, and Su-Ming leads the Environment, Development and Sustainability at the Whitaker Institute and Socio-Economic Impact at the Ryan Institute research clusters at NUI Galway. And Dr. Khoo will discuss decolonizing development theory, education and practice. So we're looking forward very much to Su-Ming's contribution. And Su-Ming recently published a really great paper with Tanya Kleibel on addressing the global emergencies of climate change and human rights from below. And I know that some of this theme, kind of working from below, are common across the participants here today. And we will then have two respondents. So each of our speakers is going to speak one after the other, and followed by our two respondents who have also co-organised this event. So it's really wonderful to see the cross-department collaboration in today's event also. So Dr. Nita Mishra will be the first respondent, and Nita is based in the Department of Food, Business and Development at UCC. Nita is a reflective development researcher and practitioner, and she also lectures in international development. And the focus of Nita's work is environment and development, environmental movements, gender, non-governmental organisations, research methodologies, and the right to food in India. Her research focuses on human rights-based approaches. She uses feminist methodologies, and works also extensive experience of working at grassroots level with civil organisations. In Nita's case, it's really great to know that she is a member of the board of directors of the Children's Rights Alliance and is in fact national coordinator of Academic Stand Against Poverty, the Irish network. She also is the chair of the Development Studies Association of Ireland, and she convenes its civil society study group. So if this is a sort of new foray for you in terms of the topic of our event today, do please look up the Development Studies Association of Ireland. And then last but definitely not least, Dr. Amin Sharifi-Izulu will respond. And Dr. Sharifi-Izulu is based in the Department of Sociology and Criminology, and his fields of interest include politics, religion, arts and culture, focusing on sociological and anthropological interpretations of symbols, images and ritual performances. Amin is the author of Power, Legitimacy and the Public Sphere, and his other publications include Cyberspace, Tazieh Symbols and the Public Sphere in Iran, and as well as Liminality and Experience, the 1979 Revolution in Iran and Shia religions. And Amin teaches race, ethnicity and migration and nationalism, as well as sociology of development and globalization. So we have a fantastic panel, and we're hoping for a really good conversation. And so without further ado, I'll welcome Professor Pádraig Carmody to share the floor. And Pádraig is going to talk for 20 minutes. We're going to keep to time so that we ensure some, really good space for discussions and Q&A at the end. So thank you very much, Pádraig.
Okay, so let me just start this. Thank you very much, Professor O'Neill. So as Professor O'Neill was mentioning there, I did a book a couple of years ago called Development Theory and Practice in a Changing World. I'm not going to try and overview or summarize the book in 20 minutes. So what I want to do is just raise a few provocations, maybe, give you my thoughts on a couple of issues around international development, and then hopefully we can have a discussion afterwards. So geographers in the last couple of years have been very interested in a phenomenon called planetary urbanization. And what is planetary urbanization? Planetary urbanization consists of a variety of dimensions, but basically it argues that as we're now primarily an urban species and as power and wealth are concentrated in urban areas along with consumption power, that what happens in cities around the world really affects not just them internally or what happens in city networks, but fundamentally structures and shapes what happens in rural areas as well. So if you think about plantations or mines or who has the decision-making power about those kinds of facilities and where they're located, do they displace people, how much do locals get employed, and all of those kinds of questions are determined in settings like world cities, oftentimes like Hong Kong, for example. And you can see kind of urbanization in Hong Kong here in very sharp relief to the countryside. Okay, that's the cover of the book. And again, it kind of riffs off this planetary urbanization theme. And we have then not just urbanization, but what's called distantiated urbanization, the urbanization of the countryside, if you like, through these kinds of power networks that I was describing a minute ago. And you can think of all sorts of implications arising from this for international development. Think about the spread of COVID-19, for example. Think about how it originated in a city, and there's a substantial literature now around the reasons for that, and the fact that we have a global biodiversity crisis, and that's implicated in the emergence and propagation of the pandemic. Think about how it spread through air connectivity between Asia and Europe and then onwards to the United States. And think about the different nodes, the specific kind of geographies of this and which places have been relatively insulated from its effects. So that's just one example of how there is a shift in the international context of international development associated with what I call meta trends. And I'll talk about a few of those in a few minutes. So a question that's sometimes asked is international development, is it a kind of failure or a success as a project? And if you listen to the World Bank or Bill Gates or Barack Obama, for example, it's a success. It's the best time to be alive in the world, net. Of course, that doesn't talk about specific places and the huge inequalities spatially and socially we see around the world. So this is just a quote from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which captures some of the contradictions, I think, of the nature of international development. So it's the best of times, the worst of times, an age of wisdom, an age of foolishness, an epoch of belief, an epoch of incredulity, a season of light and of darkness, a spring of hope, a winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We're all going direct to heaven, we're all going direct the other way. And some people have argued there's two ways of thinking about international development. One is what Gillian Hart calls big D development, which is development as a kind of project of guided socio-economic transformation that Irish Aid, the World Bank, NGOs engage in. The idea that you can direct development to improve people's social living standards, the economic performance of economies, and their happiness ultimately, although there's disputes about how these things compare to each other. And then there's also what she calls little d development, which is the idea of development as an imminent process of capitalist development, which is characterized by the generation of inequalities between cores and peripheries, of biodiversity loss, of rapid climate restructuring or even departure, where we lose the climate, cycles of climate regularity, right? We move into an era of disruption where, you can have hailstones, huge hailstones in May in Ireland and so on and so forth. So you lose that kind of regularity, and there are obviously huge implications for particularly subsistence agricultural producers around the world if we're in an era of climate departure. So in terms of approaching development, I'm not going to rehearse this too much, but there's broadly, I think, two different schools, and maybe some of my colleagues will disagree with me. There's the kind of catching up school, the development as, achieving the same kinds of living standards and industrialization as Western Europe and North America. And I think modernization theory, which was popular in the 1960s and 1970s, is an example of that. We can talk more about that if you like. And then neoliberalism, which really emerges from the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions, although it has antecedents before those, in the 1980s, and the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which were really premised on this idea that in order to catch up with the West or the rich countries, that countries around the world needed to follow the Western economic model of free markets. And then there's kind of the breaking free of exploitation kind of approach, which sees development as more characterized by this little d development, capitalist development, and that the global aid regime and systems is heavily implicated in the reproduction of inequalities globally. That it buys political influence, for example, so that big D and little d development are not seen necessarily to be something separate, but there are contradictions and tensions between them, but nonetheless, they broadly work in alignment to reproduce particular patterns of inequality spatially, socially, and in terms of gender and so on. So I've listed some of these approaches here: dependency, world systems, post-development, the idea that development is a kind of Trojan horse for Western domination. And I've also included what are called neo-Weberian approaches in here. This is the idea that the level of economic development of a state is largely dependent on the nature of that state and whether or not it has a developmental state which can restructure internally, socially, and politically in order to reconfigure the relationship with the global system and to integrate on more advantageous terms. So it doesn't debate the need for integration into the global economy, but it claims that developing societies and countries really need to plan and to configure their state-society relations in particular ways in order to take advantage of what the international system has to offer and to downplay the disadvantages, marginalization that are often part of integration into it. Okay, in terms of the global system, I sometimes ask my first and second year classes, if you were an alien viewing Earth from above, but you had kind of access to data sets, what would be the kind of things you would pick out if you were to look down on global society? And one of the first, I think, would be combined and uneven development. That is, that places are linked up increasingly tightly together, many places, through networks of capital flows of commodities and other types of trade, and that this is implicating the generation of massive inequalities, spatial inequalities. So it's the nature of the integration, whether it's productive or extractive, which will largely determine the developmental impacts. Massive inequality, as we know. I think as of last week, there are now 5 people on Earth. I think they're all men of European extraction. Warren Buffett is the latest member of the club to join, who own more than $100 billion in assets. And I think Jeff Bezos was on track to be the world's first trillionaire. At the same time, as particular parts of the globe continue to experience mass poverty, and in some cases growing numbers of people living in poverty. And there are definitional issues, and I'll talk a little bit about these. The global system is characterized by economic growth, generally, if we're not in COVID or in a financial crisis. So it's dynamic in terms of the ability to generate this profusion of commodities and to fling them around the world, if you like. But it's also characterized by these structural contradictions. That is, that the system produces these inequalities which lead to disequilibria periodically, if you want to phrase them in economic terms. Or if you are thinking about the global biodiversity crisis, or the current pandemic or future pandemics, these broader kinds of crises that we may be facing into, including climate departure. And then technological dynamism is another feature of the global political economy, which allows it to reproduce itself even as it's implicated in the generation of all sorts of socio-spatial inequalities, contradictions, and crises. And one of the primary vectors or mechanisms for the production of inequality is trade. So, for example, if you look, Germany exports nearly 4 billion euros worth of roasted coffee beans per year without growing a single bean. And most of the value is captured in the rich countries and in the big corporations that dominate the global coffee trade. So I was watching something on Ethiopia last year, which was talking about the fact that Ethiopian farmers at that point were getting 1 out of every 400 cents that a cup of coffee would sell for in Starbucks or some of the other coffee outlets. So if you spend €4, the actual producer in Ethiopia was getting 1 cent out of that €4 cup of coffee, because the branding, the packaging, the marketing, the roasting, all of those kind of different elements of the commodity chain were sources of value creation and extraction, but the actual producer was being shortchanged, if you will. So the value, many of you will know this, is primarily still added in Germany in this example. And the terms of trade then tend to favor the richer countries versus the poorer countries. So what are the terms of trade? The terms of trade are the prices you pay for your imports versus the prices you get for your exports. And because income and price elasticities of demand are low for primary commodities like coffee, if incomes go up in Ireland, people don't necessarily drink 4 cups of coffee a day instead of 2, right? So the income elasticity is low, and the price elasticity is low. That is, if the World Bank and the IMF tell Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire or Kenya or other coffee producers to produce more of it, it tends to drive the price into the cellar, because again, there's more of it being produced, but the demand is relatively static. Okay, and this locks them into what some people refer to as a trade trap. If your prices for your exports are going down, maybe you have to take on debt to continue to import medicines or oil or other things you need to keep your economy going. And primary commodities are notoriously price unstable as well. They're subject to these booms and busts. And as you saw maybe last year, for the first time ever, the price of oil went negative when COVID hit in the United States, because there simply wasn't enough storage capacity for oil. Contrast that with 2008, when a dollar of oil was going for $147.50 a barrel. So within the space of about 10 years, you see these massive price fluctuations. And again, we can talk maybe more about that if you're interested. So is development as an enterprise something which is progressive? Are we seeing progress? Well, again, as the opening quote suggested, it partly depends on what metrics you're looking at and how you measure them. So for example, life expectancy in Bangladesh rose by 10 years over that 20-year period, average life expectancy. That's huge progress. You can look at the number of children dying every day around the world. Fell by half from 1990 to 2015, but still at a rate of about 16,000 a day, mostly from easily preventable diseases, although some more recent data from sub-Saharan Africa says malnutrition is the biggest cause of infant mortality there. So an appalling kind of rate. If we think about the 3,000 people that were killed on September 11th in the United States, and think about the equivalent number of people who die every day in this kind of structural or silent violence. And then there's a debate about how to attribute this, or what to attribute this progress to. Is it to neoliberal economic policies, or is it largely to do with the rise of China? And many kind of heterodox political economists would argue that it's the latter. Now, we hear that global poverty is falling, but if you measure it not at $1.25 a day, what that would buy you in the United States per day, and increase it to $2.50, global poverty actually increased from 1981 to 2005, right? Despite the rise of China, despite the hundreds of millions of people who've been lifted out of poverty in China over the last 40 years or so as a result of economic reforms and development in that country. Okay, just a graph showing you life expectancy at birth. You can see general progress there. You see the kind of flattening for sub-Saharan Africa there in the 1980s, partly to do with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. This was a map I came across a couple of years ago, which I thought was really interesting in terms of capturing the extent of global inequality. And it shows, it's a cartogram showing the relative size of US states' economies compared to countries around the world. So Texas's economy is about the same size as Australia's, whereas California's is about the same size as Italy's, I think the 6th or 7th biggest economy in the world. And so it's a graphic representation of the scale of spatial inequality around the world. Okay, the system generates this other meta trend, which is globalized inequality. And again, I've kind of cited some of the statistics around this. And at the same time as we see new billionaires being created every day around the world, we also see the bottom half of humanity actually seeing declines in their wealth through processes of land grabbing, for example. So what happens to farmers when they're small-scale farmers when they're displaced off the land? Who benefits from that? And that's a contributor to unequalization and inequality. Apparently, ending poverty through economic growth would take more than 200 years based on the World Bank's poverty line. And anyway, the impact might be completely obviated by global environmental change, and particularly to do with climate, but also biodiversity loss. Okay, and just to start finishing up, some statistics on climate disruption or departure. 50% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gases that have been emitted in the last 25 years. So the growth dynamic of global capitalism and its incessant need to kind of expand the frontiers of accumulation spatially, socially, and sectorally is implicated in massive environmental disruption. So we've seen more than a 50% decline in wild animals in the last 40 years. And again, there are some debates about how these things are measured. And then some people have argued, of the implication of this is that we're seeing an increase in zoonoses, diseases which are transmitted from animals like bats into humans because we're encroaching into the natural spaces ever more disastrously. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Pádraig. That was really excellent. And I think, that I'm left with that opening point you made about, international development failure or success, as well as the sort of emergent nature of the concept as well, and the sort of theories surrounding. I'll introduce now, and open the floor now to Dr. Su-Ming Khoo. Su-Ming, over to you.
Okay, now I hope you can see this screen share, and let me just,
yes.
Yeah, okay. So, and I'll just put my timer on so I don't go over 20 minutes. So I'm going to pick up some points from Pádraig, and the title of my talk then is rather funnily, Elephants in the Bathwater. So I was asked to speak about decolonizing development theory, education, and practice. And I decided that I would structure this talk around a response to a really fantastic lecture and a book chapter that was written by Olivier Ruta-Zibwe from the University of Portsmouth. It's now being published in a book called Decolonization and Feminisms in Global Teaching and Learning, edited by Sarah de Jong, Rosalba Icaza, and Olivier Ruta-Zibwe. So this lecture that she gave on babies and bathwater in international development gives us a sort of a steer around how are we to think about this large landscape that Pádraig has introduced with all these mega trends, different interpretations. And the one thing, though, that is really clear about the whole development enterprise is that the post-development critics have deeply criticized the entire enterprise of development because of its coloniality, its inherent connection between capitalism and economic growth with imperialism, neocolonialism, inequality, structural racism, and some of those megatrends which were seen as being central or integral to the world of development. So in this lecture, Babies and Bathwater, Olivier Rutersipwa says that, well, you know, we've been in this critical space in critical development studies, seeking to make a departure from the coloniality of development for several decades now. The post-development discourse came about in the 1990s. How come we're still here? And let's review the whole development scenario and see, you know, what is it that we haven't managed to get away from? Why do we keep reproducing the same set of puzzles? So she uses this metaphor of, you know, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but you do want to throw out the dirty bathwater. And the bathwater is development studies itself, is our investments in development studies, our personal and professional complicity as teachers and departments and disciplines and master's programs and PhD supervisors of development studies, that we are complicit in the coloniality of development, and we derive benefits from that. But at the same time, we don't want to throw out the baby of development, which is the ideas, the desires, the energies, the things that are worth keeping, which are a kind of striving for global justice, for global solidarities, and the search for reparations for past injustices and unbearable inequalities. And this throwing out the bathwater situation has kind of come to a bit of a head. So some experts in development studies and in international development have said, well, maybe we should just stop. We should do something which Jan Orby and Sarah Delput in a blog they wrote, enact what they call a hard devsit, yeah? Exit from development. Let's stop the whole development aid, international assistance. Let's just stop this. Let's engage in more listening and dialogue. Let's stop the harmful trade and migration policies. Let's try to do structural reform. Let's reflect ourselves on the kind of development we want within the European Union. So this is kind of a European discourse by European scholars about development, about what the European Development Commission should do as the development cooperation arm of the European Commission. What should it do? It should move towards post-development, but only, you know, when it's kind of like paused and done this deficit. So in response to both of these, I wrote a short piece called Elephants in the Development Room, which tried to critically account for some of the silences in development and not throw out something that was important. One of the important things being the fact that development has never had an agreed meaning, and it's an emergent and contested concept, and these contestations have come from different locations. So therefore, you know, it's not really up to us to decide whether to end it or not, because it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to many other actors. And indeed, as a word itself, this contested and emergent word, it is a world-making word. So what does it mean to say, well, we're going to end this world-making exercise? So it's my intervention was just to say, well, let's hold on a bit, and indeed let's look at the elephants that are in the bathwater. Yeah, and of course there is a big elephant that's introduced by the progress narrative, which Pádraig talked about, the success narrative of development. Look, we've got rid of so much poverty, though yes, it's mostly China who's done it. And this is the elephant that's known as dweeb. Don't worry, everything is better. Don't worry about inequality. In particular, everything is better. So the elephant has a name, it's called dweeb, right? And so this elephant is about, ignoring inequality, ignoring the problem of wealth accumulation, and this problem that Pádraig has already raised about poverty reduction being too minimalist. So we're circling round and round this post-development critique, which I've wondered, is this a second post-development turn, since the first was so long ago? Or is it a frustration of the continuation of the first? And indeed, you see many signs of exhaustion. It's a short book just produced by Juan Telleria, looking at the paradigm of development that I'm most interested in, which is the human development paradigm. And in deconstructing all the human development reports, he finds that there's nothing very much that they have to offer. And also in the past 10 years, that there's basically a conceptual exhaustion about what human development should be oriented towards. And I think somewhere, whether it's a second turn or a continuation of the first, there is a continuing problem about what the question is structurally. And is it a superstructural question in Marxist terms, a question of culture and ideology? Or is it a question of the base, which is about some of the things that Pádraig has mentioned: unequal terms of trade, extraction of surplus? And what has populated this historical period from the 1990s until now is what in the area of international law and global governance is characterized by what you might call a long enchantment of tools. Here I draw on the ideas of the international lawyer Martti Koskenniemi, who talks about how liberal internationalism and human rights had got caught in this kind of long period of enchantment, which he calls the long 1990s, where we've just developed tools to do things so much more efficiently and effectively, and technologies of rights and law and jurisprudence, and the structures and the top technical aspect of monitoring and evaluation and benchmarking, reporting, and indeed the human development reports are one instance of these enchanting tools which have become exhausted. And then the other side then is the superstructure question, which is actually about a very different story, about the capture of these tools, and the development of rights of non-human persons. It's something I've become very interested in the story of development, because it's something that we don't really talk about. So this very nicely captured in Anne Orford's response to Martti Koskenniemi's Grotius lecture on the enchantment of tools, where she points out that it's the whole international trade, the dispute settlement mechanism, and what Katerina Pistor calls the code of capital, the legal coding of property, of intellectual property rights, of trade rights, and how these have become another mega trend or meta narrative of development that isn't spoken about. So where we are now is at a moment of inflection. Arundhati Roy called it, the pandemic being a portal which we could step through, which we could get some sort of like perspective or framing of where we are. It's hit at the very center of planetary human entanglements. It's affected us publicly and privately. And the world has been turned upside down. And this crisis moment then is a moment that we could take as an opportunity to reflect on what are the normative and the instrumental basis of global governance and the international order. And what we do see is this other meta trend that Pádraig has pointed to, a global political economy of not just a snapshot of inequalities, but a dynamic of widening inequalities, of unsustainability that is linked to inequality through something that the Afropolitan philosopher Achille Mbembe would call necropolitics. This is the politics of letting some live while others die. Or as Stefan Latzanik puts it in slightly less dramatic terms, as where some live well at others' expense. So in this, I think, is a big kind of question. So we can make lots of descriptive questions, but really it's the normative questions that I'm really interested in using the crisis to focus on. And these are, the questions around humanity, rights, and duty. So some of my recent work has focused on this. I just want to go back to this question of a first or a second post-development turn. And I think we can see at the heart of this, the question, which also links back to Pádraig's talk about his book, about the world political economy and what can be done in a program of development. And if you look at this word delinking, if you do like an n-gram search, you'll see, of course, it's mostly English language publications that represent how popular this term is. There's two spikes. Well, there's a small bump in the 1950s, which is really around the time of the genesis of the Latin American structural dependency critique. And then in 1987, there's a big peak when Samir Amin publishes his work on delinking. And his idea of delinking, then his decolonial, post-colonial, decolonial critique is based on the state and political economy. Delinking for Samir Amin is a country's ability to set its domestic development priorities and connect with its own coalition of popular forces, to bring about state policies that are not exactly 100% autarkic, isolated, but able to neutralize negative external economic influences on the development path that a state can follow. And so it's really a program of decolonization for post-colonial countries. Now, the second spike in delinking comes when Walter Mignolo publishes his work on delinking, his essay on delinking, which draws a lot on Aníbal Quijano's concept of detachment, desprendimiento. So this marks a turn towards the Latin American philosophical, historical critiques of the modern world system, which are about delinking in a slightly different way. It's delinking not as a state program, but delinking to change the terms or concepts as well as the content of broader sociological, political economy of modernity, coloniality, a 500-year-old modern world system of modernity, coloniality. And it has a big focus on epistemic delinking and the deconstructive linguistic strategies of deconstructing the rhetoric of modernity, the logic of coloniality, and from there, considering what the grammar of decoloniality would be. But of course, just to bring back to the meta trend, the elephants that are in the bathwater. So that's the kind of like the desire to decolonize, to throw out the bathwater, right? But there's these elephants in the bathwater. And I had the nice little graphic right at the head of the talk, which showed it wasn't just an elephant, but there were some other animals. There was a hyena and a warthog and a rhinoceros. There were plural attempts at epistemic delinking and critiques of the global political economy in the bath, just as you were trying to displace the bathwater, right? And yeah, here's the elephant, which is the famous elephant graph of Branko Milanovic and Christoph Lachner, which is about not about the actual distribution, but it's about prospects and worlding. So many people think that this is just an economic graph, but it's actually about the sociological imagination of the world as it is, a worlding imagination, because it's a graph of the distribution of the gains of global economic growth between the 1980s and the 2000s. And what you see is it has this characteristic elephant shape where you have this upward pointing trunk of the very small minority. These are the billionaires, but it relates them in the sociological imagination to these middle classes in the declining forehead who are capturing less of the growth, capturing a declining amount of growth, and then increasing amount in the rump and the body of the elephant, who are the very poor becoming who are the poor becoming less poor, and then the very, very poor, the destitute, are kind of falling off the tail of the elephant, and we don't see that their incomes are growing at all. And so this is about distribution, but it's also about power, and I wanted to bring the other elephant in the room, which is the one that we don't talk about, which is that we can't talk about countries anymore, as in Samir Amin's original delinking, because the majority of the most powerful economic entities are not states, but corporations. So according to Oxfam, in the top 100 economic entities, we can see that the largest proportion are not state entities anymore, they're corporations. So I've just got 2 minutes or a bit less to conclude with some questions about the post-colonial and decolonial approaches to development, because decolonial is about throwing out the bathwater of participation in unequal and disequalizing structures. But it's also about rethinking the world and recalibrating the sociological imaginary to engage with difference and different perspectives in a way, not just to pluralize the perspectives, not just to have more animals in the bathtub, but in a way that makes a difference to what was originally thought, so that the bath can fill up in a different way. Yeah. And the way that this is done is by seizing the apparatus of coding for value itself and thinking about what is valued in development, to contest modernity through looking at other sites, other forms of enunciation of different modernities, and displacing the hegemonic modernity of the colonial modern with other modernities and political possibilities. But not in a fragmented way, not in a totally, utterly relativized way, but in a connected way, in a way that makes a difference, to engage with all these different animals, or the elephant, in the bath, but in a way that makes a difference to what we originally thought development was about. So I'm going to finish there.
Thank you so much, Su-Ming. That was really fantastic. 2 really fantastic presentations. And you are, that was amazing timekeeping as well. Thank you. And just before handing over to Dr. Nita Mishra, I just want to make a point about a sort of link, if you like, between Pádraig's paper and, where he talks about development as a Trojan horse for Western development, and your point, Su-Ming, about what should human development be oriented to, what can be done. And I think this kind of, you've opened up such rich connections between both papers, but also a rich focus for our conversation around recalibrating the sociological imaginary. I'd like to invite Dr. Nita Mishra to respond to both presentations, and also just to flag up, and Nita, maybe we could put this in the chat, but I haven't had time to read your paper on using collective memory work in development education, but it looks wonderful. So it would be great to signpost that to people. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So my job is actually to respond only to Pádraig's presentation. Su-Ming, do you want to, whose slide is this? Is this?
I stopped share already.
Oh yeah, okay. I should have speaker view and I'm not getting that. Okay. I don't know why I'm not getting, I have you on my.
Let me stop my video. Does that help?
Yeah, no, it's still you. It's okay, it doesn't matter. So I'm just going to respond to Pádraig's book and not the presentation. I'm hoping I can link it to Su-Ming, but I'll leave that to Dr. Amin. So Pádraig, your book is outstanding. I have recommended it as a textbook for first years and also for the Erasmus Plus, training that I'm doing on the 31st onwards with FWHS in Germany. So it reads like a story. It has a conversational style. The language is simple and it's easy to understand. It covers almost every aspect on international development with its 12 chapters, and also kind of goes beyond the other texts on international development, which we see currently, which we use for teaching also. What I like about it is that it does take a stand. It is subtle, the stand, but it's very clear. It also offers a critical outlook and approach, which is most evident in the choice of quotes. In fact, I love your opening quote, taken from Dickens. And also, you also refer to scholars like Su-Ming has done, in fact, very beautifully and very rightly, to change the narrative of the dominant discourse, so that to show that you're not complicit to the dominant narrative and the scholars who have dominated the scene of development studies for a very long time. So basically you do refer to scholars from what is called the Global South. I also like the humor in your book, which makes it very appealing to ordinary folks. References to Melania Trump on page 38 on the pith helmet story is quite amazing and amusing. It's so you make it very seamless, it flows from one to the other. And I wonder where your stories come from, where you get such small, interesting details. And this is not the only small detail you have. The book is full of them, things that we will never know if you hadn't written them, which makes the book very endearing and interesting to read. So your list of references, like I said, are themselves a minefield of information, and one can dig into them for months. What stands out for me, because I do want to use two quotes that you have used in your book. One is that you do call out. One quote is from Escobar, it's on page 116. So you write, Escobar traces the development discourse from President Truman's inaugural speech through to the time of writing in the 1990s. He notes, for example, that the United Nations Department of Social and Economic Affairs wrote a report in 1951, which suggested the need for a complete restructuring of underdeveloped societies. So this is what the quote is. There is a sense in which rapid economic progress is impossible without painful adjustments. Ancient philosophies have to be scrapped. Old social institutions have to disintegrate. Bonds of caste, creed, and race have to burst. And large numbers of persons who cannot keep up with progress have to have their expectations of a comfortable life frustrated. Very few communities are willing to pay the full price of economic progress. And this is 1951 from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, page 15. What you also go down, you critique it in a paragraph. You say this is interesting because one, it is totally in keeping with the modernization theory. So let's not forget that. And I'll come back to that, linking it to another quote in your book. And the second is, aside from this cultural violence, development was also associated with other types of structural violence, which, like both Sue and you have said in your presentations today, associated with other types of structural violence, particularly social exclusion and poverty for those who could not keep up with progress. So this is in your chapter on deconstructing development. And then I go back to impacts of neoliberalism. And on page 78, you say, and I find that fascinating that it's like calling out and being very clear on it. And I want our students to remember this when they talk about the SDGs. So what you say is, interestingly, however, the SDGs are more overt in their promotion of the market, with goal 17 calling for countries to, now quote, adopt and implement investment promotion regimes for less developed countries, unquote, to promote foreign investment. And you quote it from Brooks, 2017. But you also say, likewise, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing Development, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly and fed into the SDGs, said that international trade is an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction and contributes to the promotion of sustainable development. We will continue to promote a universal rules-based, open, transparent, predictable, inclusive, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system under the World Trade Organization, as well as meaningful trade liberalization. This is quoted from the Sustainable Development Knowledge Platform 2015. And that's interesting that you say that the modernization narrative never stopped, not even with the SDGs. And sometimes I feel we are so moved or enamored by the SDGs. If you look at zero hunger, no poverty, climate justice, gender equality, or even when we speak about, transparent, inclusive, non-discriminatory, these are terms that you cannot actually, you find it difficult to argue against when somebody uses it and you feel, okay, maybe you don't know something, but I'm glad that you kind of link it. But these terms make us forget that goals like SDG 17 may actually undermine the entire edifice of the Sustainable Development Goals. And thanks for bringing that into the mainstream discourse on SDGs. And it is for us as teachers to point out to our students. So while I know you said that I should also give a critique to the book, okay, so what I'm trying to say, so the subject matter itself, you've tried to cover it all, and it is your prerogative as author to write on something or not write on something. And I feel perhaps you could have said a little more on the subaltern studies, which you alluded to kind of, so I was very interested in that, but we have kind of forgotten subaltern, that whole discourse, which happened, I think, in the 1990s. You could have probably said more, but then your book would be like a massive volume. It already has 12 chapters. Your later chapters are shorter chapters like the resource curves or rural development. And I know you started your presentation with urbanization, so I don't want to go into that. But I'm glad it's part of the development discourse in the current, for the current generation. I am also thinking, in deconstructing development, I would have liked to see probably more of Su-Ming's writings, for example, or other authors that Su-Ming has used, or maybe, but then I can see that, you have covered so much that it's difficult to keep up with everything, or try and, if ever you try to write a second edition of this, which I would be very interested in. What you also have a very short section on gender, a couple of pages or more probably, and that's where probably you might be critiqued a little more because gender is a big thing. But I'm also hoping if you ever write that chapter on gender and development, you won't do what other people have done so far. I would like to see, because I can see that you have used, your little snippets or those stories that you have, if you could bring those in, and probably if ever you write that chapter, you could bring in, Butler, or you can bring in Simone de Beauvoir, and probably challenge the concept of gender as it is used in international development today, because I feel we are forgetting what the whole discourse and around the term gender was. But anyway, I know we can leave it to probably Su-Ming to do that or others. But having said that, thank you for writing the book, because, and I must also thank Edward for referring this book to me. I had not known that you'd written this book. So thanks for that. And it's, I would recommend it for all students of international development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mishra. That's great. Professor Carmody, if it's okay with you, we'll go straight over to Dr. Sharifi Isilu to respond to Dr. Khoo, and then we will come back and yourself and Dr. Khoo can respond to the responses, and then we'll open it up to questions. And folks, while you're listening, you may have questions in mind, so do put your questions in the chat, and when we open the Q&A, I'll keep my eye on the chat, but also on the hands up as well. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Sharifi Isilu.
Okay. Hello, Maggie. Can you hear me, Maggie?
I can perfectly.
Okay. Okay. Can I talk now? Am I allowed?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's your
Thank you.
your space now.
Thank you. Just I'm picking up a few points from Pádraig's presentation and Su-Ming's presentation to discuss the development theory. And I try just to use examples to clarify my point here. My reading showed that most of the development theories and the word development itself are used and employed to promote capitalism, to colonize directly and indirectly other nations, and to exploit them. Indeed, theories such as the modernization theory, Rosto's theory, and the globalization theory and other theories Pádraig was talking about have left so-called underdeveloped and developing countries in liminality. The term liminality, which developed by Victor Turner, refers to any situation or object being betwixt and between a transition period and interstructural situation and process moving from one stage to the other stage. Let me elaborate this a little bit with examples I'm going to provide. The US announced $67 million additional humanitarian assistance for the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2018. And this was highlighted in the media without reviewing the role of the US in Congo. The documentary entitled A Crisis in the Congo, Uncovering the Truth, explores the role that the US and its allies have played in triggering the greatest humanitarian crisis at the dawn of the 21st century. The US created a schismogenic process in Congo by using the scapegoating mechanism and left the region in a prolonged liminality, which had already destroyed the country and killed about 6 million people from 1996 until now. The US benefits from this schismogenesis and liminality, and in this way can easily access the natural resources in Congo. We know that developing countries send trillions of dollars more to the West than the other way around. Just to mention Jason Heckel in his article, how poor countries develop rich countries, shows obviously and clearly that rich countries are not developing poor countries. In fact, poor countries are developing rich ones. Poor countries don't need charity. The US has changed about 51 governments in Latin America. For example, in Argentina, the democratically elected president Isabel Perón in the 1976 was replaced by a military dictatorship. As a result, 30,000 people disappeared. See the documentary called The War on Democracy, directed by Christopher Martin and John Pilger in 2007. In 1953, the US and British replaced the elected government in Iran with a king to support the British Oil Company, which is now British Petrol or BP. They bribed the corrupted religious leader at the time to approach the planned goal, which led the country to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Obama apologized about this a few years ago, but the question is that enough? The self-interest of developed countries affected policy on foreign aid, trade agreements, and even climate change and climate finance. If they would, I mean, the powerful countries, not only the US is here a case study and an example. If they would leave those so-called underdeveloped or developing countries for themselves, I believe most of them could exceed the liminality. A similar thing we can see in our education system. As Whitaker in 2007 outlined, addressing the crisis of higher education means addressing the testimonial injustice that disadvantages certain groups of knowers and the injustice that prevents society from understanding their experiences. The coloniality that Sue was talking about, that which must follow in the wake of political decolonization, concerns the extensive overlapping and shared struggles against the coloniality of knowledge, power, and being itself. This means for me to lead the society to exceed prolonged or maybe permanent liminality that capitalism and neoliberalism has created. A system that forces us to move forward blindly. A system that knows only power and wealth and encourages us directly or indirectly to oppress, torture, and kill anyone to reach those promised power and wealth. A system that teaches us how don't care and how to ignore gift giving and receiving process. It is clear that the epistemologies, ontologies, and methodologies that are taught at universities do not only determine what students learn content-wise, but shape how they will act as future knowledge producers. Epistemic injustices from part of the structural inequalities that poor and marginalized students have to face as they struggle to access and succeed in higher education. They face the same issues after completing their education, of course. As Atis and Breschelmacher in their research in 2013 investigate uncertain employment prospects, in many cases adverse financial circumstances, quite often slightly are above the at risk of poverty level. This is usually because negative attitudes toward immigrants result in a type of discrimination called skill discounting, whereby those with a foreign education and work experience are less valued. And also a liminal stage or condition is usually created wherein something is not properly or entirely clarified and acknowledged. Mignolo 2007 argues that the colonial modern is a problematic that extends coloniality in the post-colonial era through a combination of structured economic forces and the reproduction of underlying epistemologic and symbolic structures of domination. Just have a look at some refugees' journey. When they are asylum seekers, the accommodation condition is problematic. They are isolated and excluded. They face legal barriers in education. They have financial issues. They face lack of bridges. When they exceed the temporary and or prolonged liminality and they receive a refugee status, they face discrimination. Their academic documents are not recognized. They face lack of information. They encounter lack of bridges. After completing their education, if it is possible for them, they face employment barriers and discrimination. Their postdoctoral applications are usually rejected. Funding is not for them. In research teams, they don't have usually any place. I agree with that point that discussion on the issue of race, colonialism, and discrimination need to be located in the wider historical realm. We need to recognize the ways in which dominant groups have created subjects through differentiation and segregation, particularly in education and employment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Armin. Lots of really rich responses in both Nita and Armin's responses. So, Pádraig, would you like to first of all, before we open it to questions, just do a response to Nita? And you know, the highlights for me were your storytelling and where these stories come from. The Melania Trump on pit helmets, I'm really interested to know more about.
Yeah.
And also the question of gender.
Sure.
Yeah.
So thanks very much, Nita. That was a very generous kind of response to the book. I think you've highlighted some areas which are not necessarily my strengths, and so I think that maybe comes across a little bit in the book. I debated about whether to include subaltern studies as an element of development studies, and on balance I decided yes, I should include it, but there were two things. First of all, I read Can the Subaltern Speak several times, and I had to get a colleague to give me a tutorial, and then I was Googling Can the Subaltern Speak for Dummies and things like that on the internet, and I eventually got to a point where I felt I understood it enough to be able to write something short about it. And then, yeah, I take your point on the gender. That's not my specialism. And decolonial theories, again, others have written more and more eloquently on, so I maybe give them less coverage than some of the other theories that I spend more time dwelling on. Where I get the stories, I mean, mostly it's just from watching CNN and watching some of the African news channels. Melania Trump wore a pith helmet when she went on safari in Africa, and yeah, I was relating that to BBC series about Rwanda, where they said, oh, it's all, the great game, but they don't wear pith helmets anymore. But in fact, Melania Trump did wear a pith helmet on her trip to Africa. So yeah, thank you very much. I won't take up any more time, but I'm very happy to answer any questions if there are any.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thanks. Su-Ming, yes, could you do a response to the response?
Okay, well, I'll try to put a bit of a shape on it. And the first thing I think is that decolonization of development studies has to be, as William Jamal Richardson calls it, a problem of undone science. So it's undoing what has done and seeing what else should be done and has been done when we undo that which we take to be done, if that makes sense. And you know, in undoing science, there's a brilliant short piece by Robbie Shilliam on habitation, on what it is that we do with knowledge, inhabiting the knowledge, starting from a particular location. And if you think about the Congo, it doesn't start with the US. It starts with a much longer colonial history. I think of this brilliant historical anthropology piece done by Kaja Ekholm Friedman on catastrophe and creation, and the creation of colonial violence and colonial political economy. So the starting point, you know, the question of what the starting point is a non-trivial question in reconceptualizing what it is that we do when we do development studies, what it is that we study. So that's the first point. The second point is that, yeah, well, bearing in mind, sorry, as a writer at the first point, that the Western present, Olivier Ruta-Zibwa says it's very difficult to conceive of the space of development and to conceive of a space in development that is outside the Western present. So to think about what we assume to be the presentness of the present, and what would we think if we started from a different point? So that would be the starting point. The second then is that the work that has to be done is not only epistemic and intellectual. That is difficult as it is, because it requires us to read a lot more, to become familiar with things that we are not familiar with. But it also requires us to do some more difficult work. And this is difficult, affective, and relational work, which is about our emotions and our investments and our attachments, and who relate to and how we relate to others. And I take this point from a new resource that's been created by the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, a handbook for the work that has to be surviving and working in the longer term, developing resilience in working. And the resilience that has to be developed is affective and relational, as well as epistemically more pluralistic, to develop respect for others, to develop reciprocity, to develop trust, and to develop consent, so that these are non-negotiable and need to be done. The next point is the elephants that should not be forgotten, that we need to see continuities and innovations in structural inequality. And this is something that is not self-evident in considering liminality, which is just being at the edge or in between. So inequality itself and how this relates to shared struggles, thinking about different starting points and being aware of what are the starting points and the struggles that are already there. And this habitation, being there, paying attention to what was there, and not to think about struggles, rights, difference, divisions in an abstract way, but in a very concrete way in terms of what types of justice they are interested in. And then the difficult questions then, which are about the multipolar world, the divisions, and understanding their coloniality too, the social divisions, what are races, what are ethnicities, what are tribes, and these have colonial roots in this structuring of the colonial modern. They include internal coloniality. And this is something that we should address in delinking and address in thinking about what are the solidarities and the sharing of ideas, the circulation of knowledge that has taken place from other places, in other places, that we do not know yet, because that is not the development studies that we have done to date. So that's my long and short elephant minding tips.
That's wonderful, thank you. And I'm sure all of your contributions have elicited some great questions from the participants in this webinar. Now I know that Melissa Myers has a question, but folks, do either drop your question in the chat or raise a hand, signal in some way. I'm keeping my eye across the 2 pages of participants. So Melissa, over to you to ask the first question.
Oh goodness. Hi Maggie. Thanks. It's good at giving me so much to talk about. I have like 3 pages of notes here, stuff that I just want to keep in mind. Before I ask my question, I have kind of like it's a big issue, but there's a question that relates to Su-Ming's work and one to Pádraig's work, and I'd like to have a response from both of them. I come from a lot more grassroots level policy area. I used to be the Center of Criminology in Cape Town. Pádraig, you might be familiar. Are you from the Johannesburg? I saw you. Is that Johannesburg, South Africa? Yes. Okay, good. And one of the reports that we joined published was the UNODC, that's the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. They published the Governing Safer Cities Strategies for a Globalized World report in 2016, in which they emphasized the role of crime and violence. Just one sentence that they said, the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development recognizes that reducing conflict, crime, and violence and discrimination and ensuring the rule of law, inclusion, and good governance are key in people's well-being and securing sustainable development. So I would kind of like just your response on that, because if you, again, like a lot of these theories and stuff kind of go over my head because we usually focus more on like, listen, what can we do tomorrow? Because the Cape Flats, which is a couple of kilometers where we were from, which is like the police don't go in there. It is one of the worst, crime hit areas in the world, and you see all of these things just that they just keep happening. And the reason I'm asking that is, if you just look at Maslow's triangle, and I know that the theory has a lot of critiques about it, but at the bottom is security and safety. And that needs to be attended to first before you can go into these higher levels, which I think a lot of the developmental theories is there, and the basic issue, it's that thing about a hungry man knows no law, and my question towards Su-Ming is more about democracy. Now I had an argument with the professor about that, about him saying that democracy is supposed to be a major goal, it is the baby, it's not the bathwater. But I have an issue with that because it is fundamentally a colonialized concept, and it is being, in South Africa, it is being extorted because the people are uneducated. Culture plays a role as well, because they say that, you need to listen to what your ancestors would want. And that is being extorted, by those in power. And so I already take an issue with democracy. And again, you said that, one of the answers that is being proposed is the step back thing. And I would just maybe like you to have a response to that as well, because if you look at, for instance, the state in many of the global south, which is where my focus is mainly, you have this cycle of poverty, violence, and corruption. And corruption, of course, is where the extortion happens, from those in power and those outside as well. A lot of the governments outside thinking, listen, we're going to help, we're going to give money, we're going to invest, and it just doesn't come back to the poverty. And it's usually between that gap that they try to introduce democracy and say, listen, we're going to help build up this country, we're going to make them more sustainable, but it just never fits. So yeah, assuming I'm trying to organize my thoughts a bit here, but I would like to have just your thoughts on, whether democracy is the bathwater or the baby. And Pádraig, because violence and security was brought up somewhere, I would just like to have maybe your comment about should that have a role in developmental studies at all. Maggie, you're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Really important questions. Pádraig, would you like to respond first?
Sure, I can do that. So I was just talking to someone about this the other day, and I guess I suppose it depends on your conceptualization of security. And I think Johannesburg has the highest Gini coefficient of any city in Africa, and it's not coincidental then that it has such a high crime rate, so the highest level of inequality in any city. And yet the murder rate is apparently something like twice as high in Cape Town as it is in Johannesburg, but it's completely segregated, right, between the old European part of the city facing the sea and then the Cape Flats. And so there's debates about human security, how you conceptualize security. Is securitization a good move strategically, or does it bring in all sorts of unwanted implications and potentially kind of disciplinary processes and procedures against people living in poverty? So there's that aspect. If you're thinking about redressing the legacy of apartheid, one of the things that the Cape Town government does is it cross-subsidizes electricity from the rich part of the city to the poor part of the city. But the flip side of that is that it maintains a highly securitized environment in the rich part of the city. At one point, street children were banned. So there are all of these exclusions, which some people refer to as a kind of neo-apartheid, even as the ostensible aim is a progressive one, which is to subsidize electricity provision for people living in the Cape Flats. So there's all sorts of questions there. I mean, obviously crime is an important issue, but I'd say taking a kind of holistic perspective on the origins of crime and situating it in kind of structures of inequality and historical legacies, as some other people have talked about, is important as well.
Thanks very much, Pádraig.
Okay.
Su-Ming?
Yeah, so there are two versions. One, let's just do the bathwater first and throw that, okay? Which is the thin conception of democracy, which is something that's been invented somewhere else and is just going to be promoted regardless of what is actually there. And so that's the bathwater. And then there's the baby. The baby is, in South African terms, I take this from some work on democratic politics of socioeconomic rights written by Paris Jones and Christian Stock, that development is all about a democratic politics of socioeconomic rights. So you can't say that people are disqualified. This is the oldest excuse in democracy, is to exclude people because they are not educated. That's why women were both denied education and denied democracy. Why? Because they were not educated, so they couldn't be trusted to do democracy. But that was why they were denied education, so that they wouldn't participate in democracy, right? So to get past this, constant obstacle being put into place, there has to be a programmatic democratic politics of socioeconomic rights. This democratizes development, but it develops democracy, because democracy is not already developed, right? So this is not my words. These are the words of Jones and Stock, the politics of democratization through the politicization of social and economic rights. Now, there's the elephant in the bathwater, which is that the rights like education, like housing, like water, these have not been equitably distributed in the past because of the apartheid past of South Africa and the settlement pattern, which has meant that after a whole generation of post-apartheid constitutional equality, you have people reporting after a whole generation, after 20 or more than 20 years of this so-called free, equal South Africa, you have people saying, I have gone from a shack to a shack. When the case that was brought to the court on human rights for Irene Grootboom already determined that Mrs. Grootboom had a right to adequate housing in the Cape Flats. So that's my short answer.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You brought together the baby, the bad water, and the elephant really well. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Melissa, for your questions. We have a question in the chat from Rory Nolan, and I'll pose this to all four of our speakers. Is it necessary to diverge from neoliberalism as the basis for evaluating development globally? And in brackets, because it seems like the criteria for development is too macro scale. So would anyone like to respond from all of our speakers?
I'll respond. That neoliberalism is explicitly a non-evaluative ideology. Okay, it only says that, well, you know, you're doing development if you have a greater quantity of GDP. That is not an evaluative schema. So is it necessary to diverge from neoliberalism as the basis of evaluating development? Yes, if you want to be able to evaluate it in a way that is meaningful to people. So, and this is not really about scale, micro or macro. This is about purpose and objective or meaning, you could say. That's my.
Thank you, Su-Ming. Nita, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I would agree with Su-Ming. I think what we need to do is probably look at development completely from a non-neoliberal point of view and look at it from pluriverses, for example. And I think that can be the topic of another, you know, conversation, you know, feminisms and pluriverses.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And feminist action as well, you know, which is, you know, emerges from in your work particularly. Pádraig, did you want to respond?
Sure. So I think there's two things for me. So I think the contradiction is a scalar one to some extent, that at a global level we see kind of improvements in life expectancy, but when you disaggregate it down to particular regions, that isn't necessarily the case. So there is a geographical or scalar question there. So, you know, Bill Gates and others can claim things are going great, although he's this new book on a climate catastrophe. How to avoid a climate catastrophe. And I think we are going to be forced to diverge from neoliberalism. I think we're seeing that happening already. The global financial crisis wasn't of such force and consequence that it has forced a fundamental reevaluation of the practices of neoliberalism, even if theoretically there's been some innovation around that. But I think the coming climate disruption, departure and biodiversity crises will absolutely force a departure from neoliberalism, and we're beginning to see that, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pádraig. Armin, would you like to respond?
Yes, just in relation to neoliberalism, I need to mention, I think Pádraig already mentioned about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, that they started to privatize everything in 1978-9, I think. But the idea of neoliberalism started from 1936 based on the free market and free trade. And this free trade and free market has always benefited only rich countries. I mean, the powerful countries, maybe I have to say, not only the US, but also Russia and other countries. So the neoliberalism is a system built just to direct us or lead us to a capitalistic system that we cannot get out from that. And we are in liminal time. When I'm talking about liminality, we are in a transition stage that in prolonged time, or I don't know, maybe it will be a permanent liminality, but I cannot claim that. Just I'm telling about prolonged liminality, and we are in between and betwixt. We don't know where we are and where we will go, and that the transition state has to change to reincorporation. Wangener was talking about this rite of passages. He was telling that we have in our social life three rite of passages, and first is the separation, and second is the transition, and third is reincorporation. And the middle one is transition, that Victor Turner developed it and called it liminality. So we are in middle. That is about our modern time, and it is about the neoliberalistic system we have at the moment. And we are in prolonged liminality, and we don't know whether we will exit it or not.
Thank you so much. Nita, did you want to make a point?
Yeah, I just want to add from Pádraig's book only, but it gives me, I think we should all know, I just quote you, Pádraig. So the term liberal has different meanings in Europe and the US, where it connotes people who have left of the center political leanings, which is very interesting. However, in the UK, Thatcher, who was prime minister, was considered an economic liberal. The root of the word liberal comes from liberty, meaning freedom, hence the free market. Economics is the method. So Thatcher declared, but the object is to change the heart and soul. So neoliberalism was and is fundamentally about changing the way people think about themselves and interact with others. And it kind of has managed to do that, and it's going to take a long time to change that.
Thank you, Nita. That connects back to a previous seminar we had in the department for the Economy and Society Summer School. We had the fabulous psychosocial psychoanalyst Lynn Layton speak on neoliberal subjectivities, which kind of links with your point there. So everyone, we've done really well with time. We're 2 minutes over the 2 o'clock finish line. So thank you, Melissa. Thank you for that fantastic seminar. Thank you very much. And so, just fantastic presentations, lots of food for thought. My head is certainly buzzing. And I'm thinking about the sort of work we do, with our students around transnational feminisms, and how that there is kind of bubbling up in today's seminar is a next webinar that could connect with your work, in particular in relation to feminism, and just in terms of the responses, I've taken some notes. Why feminist action needs to think globally, or why feminist activism needs to think globally, but actually why it needs to think within what Pádraig and Su-Ming have kind of mapped out for us. And I really like this idea of, the sort of unlinking or delinking. So a future potential webinar emerging from this one. So a very warm thank you to our speakers. And so if everyone, do stop, kind of like unmute your mics, and let's give our speakers a round of applause before formally closing the seminar. Thank you. And we've got some really lovely comments in the chat, just thanking everyone. Nita, could you tell us where participants can find the recording following the seminar?
Yes, so the recording, I will send it to, I think, Maggie, you and Ammon, and then maybe on your website. I don't know about our department website. So
okay, that's great.
I'll just send it to you. I'll stop recording right now, actually.